Hi, I'm Jeff Alex, host of Living Well with MS, the podcast from Overcoming MS.
Hi, I'm Jack McNulty, a professional chef and serious OMS foodie. Welcome to Ask Jack, a special Living Well with MS podcast series, where I'll be answering food and cooking related questions submitted by you, our Overcoming MS community.
If you'd like to submit a question for a future episode of Ask Jack, please email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. That's podcast@overcomingms.org. And now, let's rev up our appetites and dig into this episode. So, welcome back to Ask Jack, where we ask professional chef Jack McNulty food-related questions for people following an Overcoming MS diet. So, welcome back, Jack.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here for another episode. I looked over some of the questions earlier, and I must say there's some excellent questions to dive into this episode.
So, this episode, we've not got a specific topic, but we're going with general questions that have come up in the forums and that have been asked of us that listeners have had about specific food-related questions. So, if we jump straight in, we've got a question from Rebecca in Scotland. And she said, I've been wondering about making a fermented cashew cheese and any tips for that. To be honest, I've actually followed Jack's tips to make a fermented cashew cheese. So it was pretty good, but I'm quite interested whether I was doing it right or not. Everyone survived, so that was the main thing. So she said, I have probiotics or could buy cider vinegar with mother, or my flatmate makes kombucha, which she could use. My main concern is to know if it's gone bad or could make me ill. I'd also love to hear some tips on eating out and how to make decisions what to compromise. I know that obviously in an ideal world, I would never compromise, but if I'm stuck one out somewhere and one option contains coconut and another option contains palm oil and another is fried in a small amount of vegetable oil, how am I supposed to make the wisest choice? At the moment, I don't take any dairy ever and would never take anything deep fried. But with oils versus, say, a skinless chicken fillet, which is the least bad option for a once in 6 month compromise. So let's start off with fermented cashew cheese. How would you go about it? So, cheese is one of the big things, I think. With dairy, there's alternatives for milk, there's alternatives for yogurt, but cheese is a tricky one because the cheeses in the supermarkets tend to be very high saturated fat. Mm-hmm. Coconut oil based cheeses. So there are also cashew cheeses. So how would we go about making a cashew cheese?
First of all, Rebecca, outstanding questions. You're kind of getting at the heart of a lot of concerns that probably a lot of newcomers are going to have. So why don't we dive into that? With respect to the cheese question, so many people are really interested in plant-based cheeses and what to do about that. So many people are trying to experiment at home and making plant-based cheese, mostly from cashews. So let's take a look first at what's going on there. In order to make sort of a cheese out of cashew nuts, there's a couple of things that need to happen. And the first thing that needs to occur is a bacteria or an enzyme or both from a living culture needs to be introduced in order to coagulate the proteins in the cashews and also to ferment the mixture and convert the starches to a lactic acid. This is going to release these flavors, this acidic component, but also start to create cheese-like flavors. It's very mild, so it's nothing like a normal cheese that you would be maybe familiar in eating, but it goes a little bit in that direction. So in order to make a cashew cheese, the first thing that you need to do is you need to grind the cashew nuts very, very fine. And then I found that it's best to heat the cashew, the pureed or ground cashew mass straight away. It sort of helps with the proteins to coagulate once you introduce the bacteria, which is the next step. And that needs to be a live culture. So something along the lines of perhaps a soya yogurt or a water kefir, probiotic capsules. I think Rebecca mentioned that, or something else called Rejuvelac, which is something I experimented with. Now, Rejuvelac is another process and something you can make easily at home, and it's basically fermented whole grains that you just basically are soaking in water, leaving at room temperature for a couple of days, and the grains begin to ferment and take on sort of a cheesy aroma. It's quite an interesting process, and it works really well in terms of creating these live cultures and enzymes to help with the cashew cheese. So that helps the process. That gets the process started, and it creates a sort of lactic acid and the cheesy flavor with the cashew nuts. But what really is necessary is to add a further enzyme at this point, something like from koji or a vegetarian rennet or nigari, which is often used to set tofu, soya milk, and convert it into tofu. This is going to bind the proteins together, and this is what's going to create a more firm or semi-firm cashew cheese. If you leave that process out, your cashew nut that's been fermented is going to be more creamy. It's going to be more of a thick dip, if you will, rather than a cheese. So just to clarify that a little bit. So that's the process. We'll put in the show notes a link to what I do and also some other places on the internet if anybody's interested in going out and experimenting with making their own, which gets to the second part of the question. How do you know if you're doing it safely or if it's gone off or if you're going to make yourself sick?
So before you get onto that, I mean, I think, because I have experimented a bit, and I think you can, because you're mentioning that sort of yeasty flavor, and you can, I mean, I've tried with different things. I think kombucha was mentioned. I make kombucha, but I haven't tried with that. But certainly I was making sauerkraut and using liquid from sauerkraut because it's a fermented liquid. That worked actually because it had that natural bacteria in it. So I'm guessing
it also has a lot of lactic acid, which is very helpful in the process.
Okay, so because that did work. I just saw that somewhere, and you could try that. And the other thing, to the thickening, I think agar agar, which is a sort of seaweed-based sort of gelatin type. I mean, the risk is it goes a bit rubbery if you overdo it, but then a small amount could bind it quite well. So there's sort of different things you can do, aren't there? You can experiment and try with like herbs and spices as well. That's, I think, to give it the flavor, adding chives, adding something to make it more spicy. I think there's all sorts you can do. It's one of those things, if you like cooking, try stuff out.
Yeah, exactly. The world is relatively open when it gets to that. And when you get in, when you put a foot into the fermentation door, then you're really getting somewhere, because there's all kinds of possibilities out there for creating interesting flavors and tastes and things that are really healthy. But you do have to be careful, because you're playing around with things that can go bad if you're not careful. So if you are getting into this world, it's very important to invest in a good thermometer, because temperatures are very important. It's also very important to work extremely clean, which means understanding how to sanitize properly all of the equipment that you're using, just to reduce the probability of something going off. Fortunately, when you're making cashew cheese, if it goes off, it's going to let you know. So there's a couple of molds that might appear on the surface of a cashew cheese. The general bluish greenish mold, those are fairly harmless. Obviously, because you see blue cheese, and that's basically just a mold anyway. So if that develops on the surface, you can just wipe that away and carry on. The more dangerous and the more common with cashew cheese is if the mold is reddish in color. And that is going to be harmful. And so if something like that develops, you're going to want to just throw away whatever you have. But mostly what's going to occur is the smell is going to go off, and it will be fairly offensive. At least it is to me, and that's usually a pretty good sign that I don't want to put something in my mouth. The other little taste test you can do is something that's starting to go off. You can put a little on the tip of your tongue, and if there's an immediate tingling that's going on the tip of your tongue, you know that the process has already started, that it's going off. So that's usually when I'll just get rid of something. I like to err on the side of caution when it comes to that sort of thing.
Okay, it's good advice. So the second part of the question was about eating out and compromises. I mean, I prior to COVID used to travel quite a lot. So different parts of the world are easier than others. Some, like the US, actually, although they don't massively follow OMS in the US, has actually been very easy. I think lots of people have dietary requirements. France, very, very hard. And then others in between. So Thailand, I found, was one mentioned of coconut here, which was certainly a compromise that I made there because lots of things contained coconut. But what is the compromise you'd make? If you've got possibly coconut, you've got maybe some palm oil, you've got some vegetable oils, which are, is there a less bad option?
I love the way that question is framed. Is there a less bad option? First of all, I think it's harder to make good decisions today than, say, a dozen years ago, primarily because there are just so many other options that are out there. There's so much stuff on the internet that is promising this or that. And people move around quite a bit more. And to get right to this situation that you were describing just now, Jeff, when you're out traveling. But in my mind, I think it's well, I don't like using terms like compromise or allowances or treats, because I think this plays tricks on the mind, and it's best to stay away from letting those terms sort of infiltrate the mind. They lure you into thinking what you miss in your diet instead of promoting what is possible. It's kind of like it's a what you can't versus a what you can do kind of mentality. I found that the trick really is to minimize the impact and try to use different strategies. So if you're out just going to a restaurant, maybe calling ahead, researching the restaurant beforehand is always helpful. Maybe even eating before you even go out so that you can stick to lighter options on the menu. And you have a lot more control on that aspect. I think anytime that you go out to eat, you have to recognize that you're already going to make sacrifices, because you're leaving yourself open to whatever is in the restaurant. And most restaurants are not going to be living on the safe side when it comes to what we expect. They're going to be using ingredients that are not necessarily the best ingredients for us. They're going to use cooking techniques that aren't necessarily the best for people following an OMS diet. And so you're already going to be a little bit behind on that. In terms of going out, when you're traveling, I think it's really, really important to just understand before you even take off what you're getting yourself into, and understand that, well, I'm not going to stress if I'm in Thailand and I want to eat because I have to eat. And if I have to eat, there might be a little bit of coconut milk. But this is a week-long adventure, and I'm just not going to stress about it. When I get home, I'm going to live in the good health lane for a good long time and make sure I get plenty of antioxidants and all of those sorts of things. I know when I travel, I follow a pretty strict 100% plant-based diet. When I travel, I do make allowances and say, okay, hey, it's just easier for me if I'm in an ocean environment that I'm going to order a little bit of fish here and there. And I just don't stress about it. I take care of myself when I get home. So I think it's understood, especially when you're starting off on the OMS diet, that you're going to make mistakes along the way. There will be situations that come up that are out of your control, and just accept them as part of, well, hey, that's just life. And it's, as long as you don't make a habit out of it, or don't say, well, this is a treat or a compromise, because that allows you to do that again at some other point. Just let it, if I find that I've made a mistake somewhere along the line, or mistakenly eaten something that I'm not supposed to eat, or not wanting to eat, I just let it fall off my shoulder and just move on. I usually have a good laugh about it and carry on. I think that's just the best way to approach it.
Yeah, I certainly, I think that the saturated fat side of it is maybe the one. So I would have a situation where I definitely wouldn't have any dairy. I definitely wouldn't have anything that had been fried, certainly absolutely not deep fried, because you know that. And to be honest, it doesn't appeal to me at all. I think you just get out of the habit. But saturated fats, I sort of think, which is where the sort of coconut comes in, you sort of think, well, okay, if literally that day, or that, I'm basically eating everything's very clean, and I've had something which has some coconut in, I think, okay, the saturated fats on that will have gone up a bit. But that I know we don't really count them. In the early days, certainly when I first met you, Jack, we was counting your saturated fats for the day, and now that's discouraged. But it's certainly still a situation where we're trying to keep that down. It can't be zero. So that's just contributing towards saturated fats. And so that's where I would think, okay, there's a bit more saturated fat in that than I would like. But actually the rest of the day I'm keeping as almost zero saturated fat day. So there I would compromise. Maybe compromise is the wrong word, but you're sort of thinking, okay, within a day, or certainly within a week, my allowances are fine. I haven't had any dairy.
That's right.
And so, I think you can always find something to, well, not always, but mostly find something to eat.
That's right. It's creating a balance, and I've found that there's, when you're out and about and you're looking for that quick snack, whether you're traveling or just in the city somewhere or something, everybody's looking for what kind of quick little fast food can I get? And people often forget, you can just go into a supermarket, and supermarkets have so many healthy things that you can just grab a banana, grab an apple, whatever, something like that. I know when I was in Australia traveling around and kind of out in the outback, and it's not necessarily the haven for good, healthy food in those locations, that oftentimes we would just slip into a grocery store, grab a piece of bread, get an avocado. At that time, I was eating a little bit more fish, maybe some smoked salmon or something, and go have a picnic somewhere and enjoy it. It was just so much easier than stressing about what can I possibly eat in a restaurant. A supermarket is a fantastic place to go find food.
And we mentioned earlier before the call about going to Italy, and pizza is a great. Pizza is almost ubiquitous around the world now. You can get pizza pretty much anywhere. And if it's a decent pizza restaurant where they're making it fresh, then a pizza without cheese on, you can say what's going to be on it. Assuming you're not gluten intolerant, that would be the only issue. But other than that, a properly made pizza without cheese, a vegetarian pizza should be absolutely fine.
That's right. And there's always options. Even a Japanese restaurant, and go have some sushi or something like that.
Yeah, just watch out with sushi.
Fish.
Sushi's a funny one. Because a Japanese sushi shouldn't have mayonnaise, but they've decided to westernize sushi. But we were eating sushi just the other day. Actually, made that at home. We like to make sushi sometimes. It's just a fun thing to make with the family as well.
That's right.
And you can make fantastic sushi. But you're right. But just watch out for the mayonnaise. But other than that, and the other thing I was going to say, I don't want to overly promote an organisation, but there's an app called Happy Cow, which is on Android or iPhone. And if you look up the Happy Cow app, it's free to install, and it works globally. I've not been to a country yet where they don't have restaurants. And basically, it's about listing vegan. You can do vegan, vegetarian, or vegan options is another one where they'll have vegan choices on the menu. So you can go to a place that's fully vegan. I think that's more for ethical vegans. They don't want to go anywhere that would possibly have any meat products. But I mean, those sort of places, and everywhere I've been has places listed on there. And then you can find some amazing things where countries that you might think were, almost had nothing. There will be something on Happy Cow. And because it's an app on your phone, I just leave it on there. If I'm somewhere and need some food, have a look, and almost certainly there'll be somewhere nearby that at least has options that are vegan.
And I would just throw one caution out there. Just because a restaurant is calling themselves vegan doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fit within the OMS lifestyle, because in today's modern vegan world, let's face it, there's just simply a lot of unhealthy food being served under the guise of vegan is healthy no matter what it is. And that's not true. That's just simply not true. And so you still have to exercise a little bit of caution.
Yeah, French fries deep fried in palm oil are vegan. So
exactly.
I think but if it's a vegan restaurant, you can then sort of, you think, okay, that's one thing out of it. So then if I'm eating things which are not obviously fried, then you're most of the way there. So you can So have a look around. There's almost always choices. So there's a sort of connected questions come up from Kay in New Zealand. She said, I used to love vegetable fritters of many different sorts. Some just with vegetables, some with flour, maybe herbs or spices. They were one of my favourite lunches. I've tried to make them by baking in the oven, but don't really like the result, which often seems to be a bit dry and a bit leathery compared to frying in oil. Plus, doesn't often have that lovely crispiness. So is there a solution or something I could do to improve my fritters? And again, so as we were mentioning vegan things, because that's, I saw the other day, because we were in a place for lunch, and they advertised they had a vegan menu. And one of the things they had was deep fried vegetables, which are vegan, but not suitable.
Yeah, so is there like a tempura or something?
That's the exact word I couldn't remember. Was tempura. So any tips for Kay?
Yeah, definitely. Kay, it's a great question. It seems like maybe you were spying on me yesterday, because I just made vegetable fritters yesterday for myself. I too like having them. The problem, of course, first of all, a vegetable fritter is sort of any vegetable that is bound in a batter or even breaded. And so they're traditionally deep fried or pan fried in oil. Falafel, for instance, would be considered technically a fritter, although we don't really think of it in those terms. But basically, that's what a fritter is going to be. I like to think of it as sort of a thick pancake batter with vegetables in it that's been deep fried. So obviously the deep fried portion is not necessarily going to be anything that we're going to want to eat if you're following an OMS diet. It does give a very lovely crispy exterior and this little soft interior. So what I found that's worked for me on making a vegetable fritter is I start by preparing the vegetables. So sometimes I'll even go ahead and pre-cook the vegetables just in a pan with a little bit of water or something, just to soften them, just to make sure that they've had a head start on the cooking process so that they're not crunchy in the middle, because I want that soft interior. Then I'm basically just going to make a batter much the same way that you would make like an American pancake or a crepe batter or something. Just make it thick. So flour of sorts. It doesn't have to be wheat flour. It can be gluten-free as well. I happened to make a corn fritter the other day or yesterday with masa harina and just polenta. Actually, it was lovely. So you get that flour, probably a little bit of starch. That always helps. The starch will help make the exterior a little bit crispy. And just enough liquid to hold it all together. So I help with the binding by incorporating as well a little bit of silken tofu. So silken tofu, a normal egg is going to weigh around 53 grams or something like that. That's a little less than 2 ounces. And so I take the same amount in weight of silken tofu. So it's about 2 tablespoons of soft silken tofu that I'll blend together with the liquid and then just create it, make a mix with the flour, put the vegetables in. Now the trick is how to cook it. So I, again, think in terms of an American pancake. I'll use a non-stick pan. I make sure it's heating for a good 10, 15 minutes on the stove at a medium-low temperature. So for instance, medium-low for me would be number 4 out of 10. And I'm just letting my pan get nice and hot without anything in it. It's not smoking away. It's just hot. So now I have some choices. Sometimes I use a little bit of parchment paper, and I'll just put ice cream scoops is what I use of batter on the paper and lift the paper right into the pan. Or sometimes I just go directly into the pan as I would by making a pancake. And I leave the temperature at medium low, sometimes maybe lifting it up to medium, and just basically watching the sides of the fritter. When they start to turn a little bit of a golden color, you should be able to easily see that. You just gently flip them and then cook the other side. So it takes maybe 2 to 3 minutes on the first side and maybe about 1 to 2 minutes on the second side. I remove them, keep them on a pan with some baking paper on it, and I continue the process until all the fritters are made. So that's part 1 of the cooking. What I will do at that point, you can actually, by the way, just freeze them for later use, or you can carry on. So I set the oven temperature now to hot. So by hot, around 200 degrees centigrade, about 390 Fahrenheit. And I'm only using the top heat. So in America, they call that broiling. In the UK, I think it's called grilling. Yeah. So it's just using the top heat in the oven, and I try to set the rack as close to the heat as I possibly can. And I just slip those cooked fritters just under the heat for about 3-4 minutes, take them out, flip them, pop them back in there, and they're very good. Develop a really nice crispy exterior and a really soft interior, and they're just delicious. So that's how I would recommend doing that.
So another question that's come in, this is a sort of multi-part question here from Emma in the UK. So she starts off with, I was diagnosed with relapse-remitting MS a few months ago and luckily found the OMS plan. What tip did you recommend for someone just starting out on their OMS journey?
Be patient. But I mean, that's actually a very common question to get. I'm assuming just starting the OMS journey on the food side. I think as a whole, you have to be patient with all of the steps, but incorporate them as soon as possible. But if you're making major changes to the food, you have to really look at your whole situation and understand what that impact is going to be in your life. I think that's one of the very first things that you want to do is understand what are you willing to do to get your health back or to get you some degree of stability when you're using the diet. I look at my cultural situation. I look at my capability in terms of cooking. I look at how much time do I have? What's my lifestyle? Am I working 100%? How do I shop? So you have to take all of those things into consideration and then just say, okay, where can I begin with all of those things? And generally what I like to tell people is take the time to learn maybe 2 or 3 really healthy things and start there. And, you know, every month, maybe every 6 weeks or so, learn something new and just keep expanding and looking at this adventure that you're now on as a way of really expanding what you're capable of doing, rather than looking at it and just saying, oh, geez, I can't do this, I can't do that, and it's getting back to that same thing I mentioned earlier. It's that mentality of, oh, I can't versus, oh, I can. And I like to encourage people to take the, oh, I can kind of route and say, well, look, I have this possibility now of really learning a lot of new things and incorporating that. Once you get beyond that, I think it's really important to look at your kitchen. Get rid of anything that's going to tempt you, and really restock your kitchen. Look at perhaps what kind of equipment you have in the kitchen, what might be necessary, and set yourself up for everything that you possibly can do to make your life a little bit easier in the transition. And part of that is eliminating all those temptations.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of cooking with a whole food-based diet. Actually, it just takes you back to cooking properly. And I've found that there's a lot of the food I don't feel I'm missing out. I'm actually cooking delicious food now because I'm not cooking ready meals. I'm actually cooking properly. And having a folder of recipes is really handy. Just when you find a good one, add it to the folder. If you find improvement, change that one, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And then you've got your own recipe book of suitable things. Which is, I know they're no-brainers. They all work. They're all absolutely fine. So I can always just go into my own recipe book. And when I find one, I mean, I know you're probably not supposed to photocopy recipe books. I'm sure there's copyright issues against that, but if I own a recipe book, then I just photocopy, so I add it to my go-to, because whatever book you get, there's going to be ones that work, ones that don't work. Vegan cookbooks, as we've mentioned, there's going to be plenty of things you can't eat in there. There's a sort of a few very high-profile vegan chefs who've got lots of good stuff, but equally have some things that are not compliant. So it's just finding the good ones. So to go on to her actually, I'm going to go to her third question. If you fancy a takeaway, what would you choose? So I think we've probably covered something. So personally, I think if it's a last-minute takeaway, pizza's my pretty much go-to. But what would you think if you fancy a takeaway?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the scenario of where I find myself. And again, it's kind of a little bit similar to what we were talking about earlier, but I can't emphasize enough, don't forget about the supermarket. There's just so many different things that you can quickly go in there and grab, and just go find a nice bench in a park somewhere and have a picnic. Generally, those are going to be much more pleasing and satisfying meals than sitting down and stressing in a restaurant somewhere and, trying to have a discussion with someone that's totally not interested in your health. And just kind of take control of the situation and try to find something that you can enjoy.
I think the one time I've had a massive problem and it didn't work was a long delay at an airport. And literally there was nothing at the airport that I was comfortable with. There was no fresh food at all. It was basically there was some fried chicken outlets, and the stuff for sale in the shops was massively processed, and so that's the only time I think that I literally went hungry. I just thought, there's nothing I'm going to eat here. This is no good. And so a small provincial airport, and then a long delay, and so that's the only time really, I'd say.
Yeah, fortunately, those situations don't come up so often. Generally, no matter where you are, there's always going to be some kind of option that you can look to. The real question there is, satisfying that temptation, because when you're really hungry, all your senses are out there, and you're craving things that are probably not going to be necessarily good. Because when you get to the point of hunger, biology sort of takes over, and you're going to crave fats, and you're going to create salty kind of snacks or something that's fatty. And obviously those are the things you want to stay away from. So you have to get over that at some point and just say, okay, look, I don't want to go down that road. So maybe I'll eat a banana instead.
And the other thing is to be more prepared. I mean, I think my daughter's much better at this than me, although she's not got MS, but she does largely follow the diet. And she's always got these like homemade flapjacks or sort of protein bites, and that she's actually, whatever happens, then she's got a load of homemade flapjacks that she can, which will fill her up. So there is that. And I probably shouldn't have been going to. I think I was coming back from the Alps, and it was. And so I hadn't had the opportunity to make anything, but it's just one of those things. Like, and it is the only time it's happened, so there's always something. Otherwise, and I'm going to go. So I skipped her last question, but then a second one because it's a very difficult one. What is your best halloumi replacement?
Well, for those who don't know, halloumi is a cheese that's from Cyprus, and it's made from a combination of goats and sheep milk traditionally, although some of the newer versions have cow's milk in them. And it's really beloved in the Mediterranean because it grills very nicely, and you have that sort of soft interior, and the shape holds on the exterior. There are some vegan versions that are around, but I would not recommend going down that path. I've looked at some of those. They're all really quite unhealthy. So I would say there are no real replacements for halloumi. However, what you need to really ask yourself is, what is it that you're missing about the halloumi cheese? Is it the texture? Is it the flavor? Is it the sensation of eating something warm that's sort of meltingly oozing? And try to understand a little bit about what you're missing there, and then saying to yourself or asking yourself, what are the replacements for that? So with halloumi, first, the first things that spring to my mind are eggplant would be one, and tofu would be another. So with eggplant, when you cook eggplant in a certain way, I mean, even roasting it, you're going to have that sort of nice exterior, but inside can be very meltingly oozing, sort of like a cheesy experience. So you can just dress it up with a little bit of oregano and a little bit of salt and have something similar. The same can be said with tofu, which people are afraid to use for a number of different reasons, but there are different textures of tofu. So anything from very, very soft to semi-soft to very firm. And what you can do is with any of them, say with even a semi-soft tofu, put it in a marinade for 30 minutes to an hour, something that's acidic and salty and that sort of thing. And then just simply grill it or pan fry it without any oil. It's not necessary. And it's going to give you a crispy exterior and a nice soft interior as well. The thing about tofu is it sort of works like a sponge in many cases. It just sops up whatever flavors you add to it and in the environment. So if it's sitting in a marinade for a while, that's often a great way to do it. I often do this exactly that with tofu. I marinate it first, take it out, I grill it, and then I put it back in the marinade and just let it sit overnight. And it just takes on a beautiful flavor. That's something very similar in a lot of respect to chicken breast, if you can believe that. So it's something you can replace if you ask yourself the right questions. And maybe the right question in this case is not necessarily how do I replace cheese, but how do I replace the characteristics of that cheese that I might be missing?
I mean, tofu for me is a real. I'm discovering more and more about tofu because it's many different things. You mentioned silken tofu, but actually having like a firm tofu that lately I've been just chopping it up into sort of bite-sized pieces and just putting it in the oven for 5 or 10 minutes. And it just gives it a texture of sort of like that bite texture of sort of a meat. And I'll do that. I was doing some sort of prawn-based like fajitas it was to make, but as an alternative to the prawns, it just had that, sort of, rather than just a vegetable fajita, I was doing it with tofu. But by putting it in the oven for a little bit, it just gave it that sort of, almost not quite crisp, but it gave it a certain bite characteristic. And you can make it, and as you say, it basically doesn't taste of anything. So any spices or herbs you add to it, then it sucks up that flavour. And it's got and a really variable texture.
That's right. I mean, it's one of the great things about following this diet, and if you really embrace it in the right way, perhaps years ago I would have been one of those people that said, "Oh, tofu, woo, that's for the hippie generation or whatever. It's not for me." That kind of attitude. But now I look at it completely differently, and it's the same as what you were saying. Man, there's just, the world is completely opened up to wonderful new flavors and textures and different things. And when you get into tofu, you can understand that there are many, many ways to use it. And it's just a fabulous ingredient if you can tolerate the soya. Certainly most people can, and the Japanese have been using it for, centuries.
Yeah, and just as a personal question, what's the difference between tempeh and tofu? That's something you see quite a lot in menu in recipes.
Yeah, so tofu, the process of making tofu, like a firm tofu, is basically you're making a rich soya milk first, and then that soya milk is set with an agent, either calcium or something like nigari. Something like this, and basically it's going to start to set the soya milk in much the same way that cheese and the proteins will coagulate and the whey will separate out until it's just strained and then it's pressed or eaten soft or that sort of thing. So that's how tofu is made. It's made from soya milk. Tempeh is made comes from Indonesia, and it's basically made with whole. And the traditional way is with whole soya beans, and those are pressed together in a cake-like process, so that it's basically a cake of cooked soya beans, and then a mold is introduced or inoculated into that, and it creates a sort of white strand that you would see in tempeh. So it's basically going to ferment the tofu, or the soya beans in this cake-like environment. So it'll have a much different flavor, but that's the general difference between the two.
Okay, so because it said you could use tofu as an alternative, and I have, but I'm just tempted. I might try the two. Yeah, and so it's more of a different flavor would be the
definitely. It's a different texture, different flavor. Tempeh happens to work fabulously if you just take a few slices off a block of tempeh and put it in a food processor and grind it up. It gets you really close to something like a ground meat sort of existence. And then you can incorporate that with other things to create veggie burgers or meatballs. If you work with lentils or something like this, and mix the two together, it's going to give you a fabulous sort of experience along those lines.
Okay, and for a final question, from Nicola in Canterbury in the UK, do you have any good ideas for a bechamel-type sauce? She's been trying to make a good lasagna, but haven't found anything yet that tastes that great. It's one of the few meals I miss and have not been able to convert successfully. So I'd be interested in this because I know what I do for a lasagna, which is lasagna is a pretty common recipe we have in our household. It's something that goes down well with the kids, and the base is fine. I mean, a vegetarian tomato and vegetable base, that's fine. The lasagna sheet's fine, but it needs to have the sauce,
that creaminess from the bechamel. Huh?
Yes.
So for those that don't know, let's just start there. So a bechamel sauce is actually one of the classical French mother sauces that Escoffier wrote about years ago. So a bechamel sauce, the base sauce is the original one, is equal portions of fat, typically butter and flour, melted together in a pan, and then milk slowly introduced into that mixture and allowed to just slowly simmer until it becomes a sort of thick, creamy sauce. And then from that, you can make any of a number of other different types of sauces. So it's become a very important preparation in many, many different types of food. In France as well as in Italy, they use it a lot there. So the way to do it in an OMS-friendly or even a vegan method, and the way I do it is I will heat up my pan nice and slow again, medium low temperature. You're not going to want to use high temperatures for this. So again, around 4 out of 10, if you can picture that on the stovetop. Then I use either extra virgin olive oil or unprocessed rapeseed oil, which I'll measure out, which is important to measure how much it weighs. And then I add it to the pan. So I typically will say that's 50 grams. So that's going to be 2.5 tablespoons or something like that of oil going into the pan. Then I'll measure out an equal amount of flour. So again, 50 grams, that's about 2.5 tablespoons of flour. And I mix that in with the oil as the oil just starts to get warm. And then I'm just turning it with a spatula or a whisk. It will amalgamate really quickly into the sort of very thick kind of paste-like substance. At that point, you're just going to start wanting to add your liquid. And so I use a combination of soya milk and water. For the amounts that I talked about, the 50 grams of each of the fat and the flour, you're going to need at least 1 liter or about 1 quart of liquid. And so I will go half and half, water and soya milk. And I just start to make sure that liquid is warm. And I just slowly add it to the mixture of the flour and fat while I'm turning it and whisking it. I'll add the liquid over the course of maybe 2-3 minutes, and then it will just sort of start to thicken up. At that point, you're going to want to season it. So I get my salt and pepper into it. Be careful with the salt. You don't want to over salt. I usually add some freshly ground nutmeg to it. And I'll chop up an onion and put a fresh bay leaf into the mixture. And I just let that slowly simmer and thicken. And it will take about 20 minutes. People want to make a bechamel too fast. If you make it too fast over higher heat, the starches will just expand too fast and sort of explode on you. And that's how the sauce won't ever thicken at that point. And it would just kind of split and look sort of ugly. But if you take your time and just take about 20 minutes or so, it turns into this really creamy, nice sauce, and you're cooking out all of the starch flavor at the same time. You can add a little bit more liquid as necessary if it becomes too thick, which it will over time. And then just when you're happy with the consistency, just strain it into a clean container, cool it, usually with a piece of plastic wrap right on the surface. And you can refrigerate that for 2 to 3 days. So you can actually make that ahead of time before doing the lasagna. So if you wanted to do the lasagna, the way I would do it is I just get my baking dish out, put a little fresh tomato sauce down on the surface of the baking dish, get my uncooked pasta sheets on there, put a little bit more tomato sauce onto the pasta sheets, give it a good layer of bechamel. Whatever filling I'm using, typically I would do something with mushrooms and aubergine or eggplant, however you want to call that. Make sure that's cooked first. And then I just create 2 or 3 more layers of that, always finishing with a layer of bechamel on the top. And my final tip with the bechamel, the final bit on the top is I always add a little soya yogurt. to the bechamel to loosen it up a little bit so it spreads evenly, and it gives it a little bit of an acidic bite, which is fantastic in a lasagna. So in the OMS cookbook, there is a recipe for a fish lasagna for those that eat fish. It's on page 145. I know that recipe quite well because my wife submitted it. So I've eaten it plenty of times. And also, I know that there's an eggplant mushroom lasagna, one of my first recipes I submitted to the OMS website from years ago. And I know that's still on the website. So you can just search for recipes there and look that recipe up.
So my bechamel, I'm curious what you think of it, actually, because it's quite different how I create my bechamel.
Oh, no.
So, yeah. So I start with corn flour and some oat milk is the milk I tend to use most, but I mean, any vegan milk would probably do. So corn flour and just making a paste with oat milk and then adding more and more oat milk and whisking all the way through, but without any heat. So I'm just starting with a paste and ending up with just a liquid. And then I heat that until it gets the right consistency. Once it starts to boil in the pan, then it kind of becomes thick. So that's kind of my base. So I actually do it with zero oil, and it just gets that thick. And then salt and pepper and bay leaves, as mentioned, and nutmeg. Yeah, absolutely, nutmeg. Quite a bit of nutmeg. But the other thing that I add is yeast flakes.
To give it a bit of a cheesiness,
and it gives it that cheesy flavor. So and it thickens it up a bit more, but quite a lot of yeast flakes added to it, I would say. And yeast flakes, are they fine to use to have that cheesy sort of flavor?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I do incorporate that into my bechamel at times when I want the sauce to have some sort of cheesiness to it. So I would use that bechamel and put some yeast flakes in it if I want to make some kind of gratin, for instance. So a vegetable gratin, and I give a little bit of this bechamel right over the top, put it in the oven, and it works fantastic. I mean, it will gratinate perfectly. But in terms of your method, it's an interesting method. I got to say,
I made it up. I didn't.
I'm probably going to go try that this afternoon now. I've not done that before, using a completely no fat method. I'm a little bit more of a traditionalist with my training as a chef, so I've kind of stuck to the traditional method with bechamel. But it is interesting. It's intriguing. I'm wondering about the overall flavor and the creaminess of it. The risk when you're using just a starch rather than a flour, which has obviously starches in it, but if you're just using 100% starch, the risk would be with too much heat or when there's an acid involved of that particular sauce splitting or not holding its binding capabilities over time. So I would have to look at that and see how that works. On the surface, it sounds like a pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, it works. So but it's done. It without any skill. It was just experimentation to see what would work with.
Well, there you go. We've got the new Jeff bechamel recipe to send out.
And then the other thing, the only other difference we do is breadcrumbs on the top to have the crispy top. So adding breadcrumbs on the top before it goes in the oven gives it a sort of crispiness.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fine. That's a good idea. I often do that actually with spaghetti, which is a classic way to do it in Italy as well. Southern Italy, they do that a lot. And with the tomato sauce or whatever, to put a little bit of toasted breadcrumbs on the spaghetti right at the end, it adds a fabulous little crunch to any sort of pasta dish.
So I think from this episode, I think one of the things we've gained really is you're not missing out with these diets. It's really, you can try things out and you can learn a new way of cooking and actually experience new flavors and delicious food. I mean, I think that's it. If you're cooking, if you're going back to actually cooking food rather than sticking something in a microwave, you'll actually find the food is better. Yes, there's a little bit more effort involved, but actually it's healthier and it tastes really good.
And it makes you an active participant in your own program, in your own life. I mean, you're taking a little bit more control over what you're doing with the food that you're putting in your body. And I think anytime you take on that kind of personal responsibility, it's only going to end in good.
And finally, I'd just like to say, if there's any other questions, we have got a little bit of a bank of a few questions still, but if people do have questions, then please do email podcast@overcomingms.org with questions for Ask Jack, and because regular episodes, and it'd be great to have some more questions.
I believe our next one actually is scheduled for November, and we're going to talk about holiday food. So it's never too early now that we're in September to start thinking about Christmas already.
Oh, it's literally when we're recording this is the 2nd of September. We're already. So you've decided summer's over.
That's right. Move on to Christmas. Let's go.
Okay. So but it's a good one because your traditional, whether it be Thanksgiving, whether it be Christmas, whether it be Hanukkah, the meals that are served are very non-OMS compliant. So it's really great to, if people want tips for what to do as a celebratory meal, whether it be Christmas, whether it be another celebration.
Large families involved and big gatherings and things.
Absolutely, yeah. So any questions about that would be very well received. So
especially
again,
pies, let's talk pies for holidays, huh?
I was thinking that when you said Australia, that was my memory. Travel around Australia was a savoury pie. That's pretty much a go-to for Australians, which again very much non-compliant. So with that, thank you very much for joining us again, Jack McNulty.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ask Jack, the special 5-part series where we dive into questions from our OMS community about all things food. Please check out this episode's show notes at overcomingms.org/podcast. You'll find all sorts of useful links and bonus information there. If you would like to submit a question for a future episode of Ask Jack, please email us at podcast@overcomingms.org. You can also subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. Ask Jack is kindly supported by a grant from the Happy Charitable Trust. If you would like to support the Overcoming MS charity and help keep our podcast advertising free, you can donate online at overcomingms.org/donate. Thank you for your support. Ask Jack is produced by Overcoming MS, the world's leading multiple sclerosis healthy lifestyle charity. We are here to help inform, support and empower everyone affected by MS. To find out more and subscribe to our e-newsletter, please visit our website at overcomingms.org. Thanks again for tuning in and see you next time.